There comes a moment in life when believing starts to feel heavier than doubting. Not because something dramatic happened, but because nothing did. The days kept passing, the effort continued, and yet the answers never arrived. You kept showing up, kept trying to live with intention, kept choosing what you thought was right, but the sense of reassurance never followed. And slowly, without anyone noticing, belief stopped feeling like hope and started feeling like weight. Most people never say this out loud. They assume something must be wrong with them, that if faith feels exhausting, it means they are doing it wrong, that if certainty never comes, they must be lacking something essential. So they keep going in silence, carrying questions they are afraid to touch, pretending that confidence is just around the corner, even when it never seems to arrive. There is a particular loneliness in continuing without proof, in waking up each day and choosing meaning when nothing confirms it back to you, in acting as if your choices matter while the outcome remains completely unclear. This kind of endurance rarely looks admirable from the outside. It looks ordinary, quiet, almost invisible, and yet it is often where the deepest internal battles are fought. Some people reach a point where they stop asking for certainty altogether, not because they found peace, but because they are tired of being disappointed by expectations that never materialize. They learn how to move forward without answers, how to hold questions without resolution, how to live with the discomfort of not knowing whether their effort will ever be justified, and still, they continue. This is not the version of belief that is usually talked about. It doesn't feel inspiring. It doesn't come with confidence or clarity. It feels more like walking through a long stretch of road without signs, trusting that movement itself is better than standing still, even when the destination remains unseen. If you have ever wondered whether continuing without reassurance still counts as faith, if you have ever felt the quiet fatigue of believing without evidence, then you are closer to this story than you might think. Because long before belief was treated as certainty, it was something far more fragile and far more human. Over time, something shifts inside a person who keeps going without reassurance. At first, the lack of certainty feels temporary, like a phase that will pass once the answers arrive. But when they don't, belief quietly changes shape. It becomes less about confidence and more about endurance, less about expecting clarity and more about learning how to function without it. There is a strange tension in living this way. You begin to realize that certainty was never the thing holding you together. What carried you was movement. The decision to take another step even when the ground ahead looked no different from the ground behind. You start to understand that stopping would feel worse than continuing, not because you know where you are going, but because stillness would force you to face the weight of unanswered questions all at once. This kind of persistence is rarely celebrated. It doesn't announce itself. There are no visible victories, no clear milestones, no moments where everything suddenly makes sense. It looks like waking up and doing the next small thing, like choosing patience when impatience would be easier, like resisting the urge to demand explanations from a world that has never promised to provide them. Eventually, a quiet realization settles in. Maybe belief was never meant to remove uncertainty. Maybe it was meant to teach a person how to live alongside it, to carry doubt without being consumed by it, to move forward without requiring constant confirmation that the path is correct. This realization does not bring relief in the way people expect. It brings sobriety, a grounded acceptance that some questions will remain open and that life continues anyway. For many, this is the moment when belief becomes deeply personal, stripped of performance, stripped of expectation, stripped of the need to appear confident. What remains is not assurance, but commitment, not answers, but presence. A quiet willingness to keep walking, even when the only thing you can say with certainty is that stopping would cost more than continuing. There is a quiet moment when a person realizes that what they are doing no longer feels supported by certainty, habit, or reward. They are not being carried by enthusiasm anymore. They are being carried by choice. A choice made repeatedly, often without emotion, often without confidence, simply because abandoning the path would feel like losing something essential about themselves. This is where belief becomes stripped of its decorations. No longer something that offers comfort on demand, but something that demands presence. It asks a person to stay awake to their own life, to remain attentive even when nothing new is happening, even when progress cannot be measured. It is a state of quiet vigilance, where meaning is not given, but sustained. Many people mistake this phase for failure. They assume belief should feel lighter with time, not heavier. They expect clarity to grow, not questions. And when that does not happen, they wonder if they have missed their chance, if they misunderstood something fundamental along the way. But what if this heaviness is not a sign of loss, but of depth? What if belief was never meant to eliminate uncertainty, but to mature within it? There is a certain honesty that emerges when illusions fall away. When belief is no longer about arriving somewhere, but about remaining faithful to the act of walking itself. In this space, there are no guarantees of reward, no promises of resolution, only the quiet dignity of continuing, of refusing to let confusion have the final word. Long before belief was shaped into doctrine or language, it existed like this, as movement without assurance, as loyalty without clarity, as a human response to a world that does not explain itself. And it is from this fragile, uncertain place that the story we are entering begins. At some point, it becomes clear that what sustains a person in moments like these is not conviction, but orientation. Not knowing exactly why they continue, but knowing that turning back would fracture something inside them. Faith, in this sense, is no longer about believing something will work out. It becomes about choosing a direction and staying aligned with it, even when the reasons feel thin. This is where many definitions quietly fall apart. Faith stops resembling confidence and starts looking more like discipline of the inner life. A willingness to remain present when distraction would be easier, to keep choosing attention over escape, to stay engaged with one's own existence rather than numbing it with certainty, noise, or explanation. There is an uncomfortable honesty here. Faith does not remove doubt, it coexists with it. It does not silence questions, it carries them. It does not promise relief, it demands responsibility. The responsibility to live deliberately in a world that does not offer clarity on demand. To accept that not everything meaningful will ever be proven or resolved. For many people, this realization marks a turning point. Faith is no longer something inherited, assumed, or performed. It becomes something practiced quietly, often invisibly, not as a feeling, but as a posture, not as belief in outcomes, but as loyalty to a way of walking through uncertainty without abandoning oneself. Seen this way, faith is not fragile because it lacks answers. It is resilient because it has learned how to survive without them. It is less about what one expects to receive and more about what one refuses to let go of, even when the road offers no reassurance at all. When faith is understood this way, it stops being something abstract and becomes something embodied. It is no longer held only in thoughts or words, but in posture, in rhythm, in the way a person moves through days that offer no clear signal of progress. Faith becomes visible not in moments of certainty, but in the quiet consistency of those who keep choosing alignment over relief. This kind of faith rarely feels heroic, it feels repetitive, it feels ordinary. It looks like returning to the same unresolved questions and deciding, once again, not to let them dictate the direction of one's life. It is faith practiced in the mundane, in the absence of emotional reinforcement, in the long stretches where nothing dramatic happens and nothing resolves. Over time, this practice shapes a person, not by removing doubt, but by teaching them how to carry it without collapsing under its weight. They learn how to live without demanding immediate meaning, how to resist the impulse to measure their life only by visible outcomes. Faith becomes less about believing something specific, and more about refusing to abandon the act of meaning-making altogether. There is a quiet strength in this refusal, a strength that does not announce itself or seek recognition. It is the strength of remaining engaged with life, even when life does not respond in kind, of continuing to choose coherence over chaos, direction over drift, presence over escape, not because the path is clear, but because walking it has become an expression of who they are. It is from this lived, practiced faith that the ancient words we are about to encounter begin to resonate. Not as distant ideals or unreachable standards, but as reflections of people who walked through uncertainty long before it was named, and who discovered that faith, at its core, was never about clarity, but about continuing. It is from this lived experience that an ancient text begins to sound unexpectedly familiar. Not because it offers answers, but because it describes people who move through life in the same unresolved way. Long before belief was organized into systems or doctrines, it was recorded as something observed in motion. People acting, choosing, leaving, building, waiting, often without seeing the outcome of what they had committed themselves to. This is the tone of the chapter we are entering. It does not begin with instructions or commands. It begins with a description. Faith, it says, is not possession but orientation, not evidence but substance, not certainty about what will happen, but a way of relating to what has not yet appeared. The language is careful, almost restrained, as if it understands how fragile belief can be when it is asked to carry more than it was meant to bear. What follows is not a list of ideals, but a collection of lives. Ordinary people placed in extraordinary uncertainty. People who acted without knowing how their choices would be interpreted later. Who stepped into directions that made sense only because standing still felt impossible. Their faith is not presented as emotional confidence, but as movement shaped by trust in something they could not fully articulate. Again and again, the chapter returns to the same quiet pattern. Someone is called to leave, and they go. Someone is asked to build, and they build. Someone is invited to wait, and they wait. Not because the future was clear, but because remaining aligned with that inner orientation mattered more than immediate understanding. Faith appears not as a moment, but as a sustained posture across time. Read this way, the chapter stops feeling distant. It begins to mirror the interior life we have been describing. People living without guarantees, choosing direction over certainty, and discovering that faith was not what removed the unknown, but what allowed them to live meaningfully within it. One of the first loves the chapter lingers on is someone who was asked to leave before he knew where he was going. Not because the destination was clear, but because staying had stopped making sense. There was no map, no visible future waiting for him. Only a direction that felt necessary, even if it felt unreasonable. So he left what was familiar, carrying with him more questions than answers. This kind of departure is rarely dramatic from the inside. It does not feel brave. It feels disorienting. It feels like choosing instability over comfort without being able to explain why. The chapter does not describe certainty in this moment. It describes obedience without explanation, movement without clarity, a willingness to trust that alignment mattered more than understanding. There is something deeply human in this choice. Most people will face moments where remaining where they are becomes more painful than stepping into uncertainty. Not because the future looks promising, but because the present has become unbearable in its stillness. Faith, here, looks less like optimism and more like refusal. A refusal to let fear decide the boundaries of one's life. What is striking is how little attention is given to outcomes. The text does not rush to reward this decision. It does not soften the cost. It simply records the movement. A person left, a life shifted, something irreversible began. Faith is located not in what was gained, but in the act of going when staying would have meant a quieter kind of loss. In this portrait, faith is not a belief about the future, it is an action taken in the present. A step made without guarantees, a life open to risk because remaining closed would have meant slowly disappearing. And this pattern, once introduced, does not fade. It repeats again and again, in different lives, in different forms, all carrying the same quiet weight of choosing direction over safety. Another life in the chapter unfolds not through departure but through waiting. Years pass, seasons change, and nothing visible seems to move forward. The promise that once felt vivid slowly becomes distant, almost abstract. What remains is routine. Days filled with repetition, with small tasks, with the quiet awareness that time is passing and the future is not arriving. Waiting like this reshapes a person. It strips away the excitement that often accompanies belief in its early stages. What is left is something more exposed. A decision to keep living as if meaning still exists, even when the shape of that meaning cannot be seen. Faith here does not look active, but it is deeply demanding. It requires staying open when disappointment would feel safer. There's a particular ache in believing something that seems increasingly unlikely, in carrying a hope that time keeps eroding. The chapter does not romanticize this tension, it simply observes it. A life lived between expectation and reality, stretched thin by years of unanswered longing. Faith becomes less about anticipation and more about endurance. What is remarkable is not that the waiting eventually ends, but that it is honored at all. The text gives weight to the years where nothing happened, to the quiet persistence of continuing to orient one's life around a promise that could not yet be verified. In doing so, it suggests that faith is not measured only by moments of fulfillment, but by the length of time a person is willing to remain faithful to something unseen. In this portrait, faith does not overcome time, it lives within it. It grows older, more fragile, more sober, and yet it does not disappear, it adapts. It learns how to exist without constant reassurance, discovering that waiting itself can become a form of trust, even when the heart grows tired of hoping. Another life in the chapter is remembered not for what it achieved, but for what it attempted without any visible reason to believe it would work. The action itself appeared unreasonable. There was no evidence to justify it, no precedent to support it, no shared understanding that made the decision feel safe. And yet, the work began. Day after day, effort was invested into something that seemed disconnected from reality as others experienced it. This kind of faith often attracts misunderstanding. From the outside, it looks excessive, misguided, even foolish. Questions arise. Why continue? Why invest so much energy into something that shows no immediate result? Why build for a future no one else can see? The chapter does not record arguments or explanations. It simply shows persistence, hands at work, time passing. A life oriented around a conviction that could not be defended logically. What makes this portrait striking is not courage, but isolation. Faith here unfolds in near-complete solitude. The person acts without applause, without reassurance, without confirmation that they are understood. The work itself becomes the expression of belief, not because success is guaranteed, but because abandoning the task would mean betraying an inner alignment that has already been chosen. There is something deeply costly about this form of faith. It requires carrying misunderstanding without becoming bitter, continuing without becoming defensive, accepting that meaning may not be recognized in one's lifetime. The chapter honors this cost by refusing to shorten the story. It allows the long obedience, the repetitive labor, the quiet endurance to stand on their own. In this life, faith is neither a feeling nor a conclusion. It is a sustained commitment to act in accordance with something unseen, even when doing so separates a person from the logic of the world around them. And once this pattern is revealed, it becomes impossible to unsee. Faith, again, appears not as certainty, but as fidelity to a calling that does not ask permission from circumstances. Another life in the chapter is remembered for a moment that could never be undone. A decision made not in comfort but under pressure. Not after long preparation, but in response to a demand that felt sudden, unreasonable, and deeply personal. Faith here is not spread across years of routine. It is compressed into a single act that carries the weight of irreversible consequence. What makes this moment so unsettling is how little emotional protection it offers. There is no promise of explanation, no assurance that the outcome will soften the cost. The chapter does not dwell on internal dialogue or moral reasoning. It simply records obedience in the face of potential loss. Faith appears not as certainty of rescue, but as willingness to surrender control over what matters most. This is where faith becomes dangerous, not violent but exposed. It places something precious into uncertainty without knowing whether it will be returned. The risk is not symbolic, it is real, and that is precisely why the chapter refuses to sentimentalize it. Faith is shown as trust that extends beyond self-preservation, beyond calculation, beyond the instinct to secure one's own future at all costs. Yet even here, the focus is not on the outcome. The story does not rush to relief. What is honored is the readiness to act before clarity arrives. The capacity to move forward even when the emotional cost is fully understood. Faith in this life is not about bravery. It is about relinquishment, about choosing alignment over possession even when the loss feels unbearable. In this portrait, faith reaches a threshold. It asks not only for time or labor, but for surrender. And by placing this story among the others, the chapter suggests that faith is not a single shape. Sometimes it is patience, sometimes it is persistence, and sometimes it is the courage to loosen one's grip on what feels essential, trusting that meaning is not destroyed by uncertainty, even when the risk feels absolute. Other lives in the chapter are remembered not for singular decisions, but for the environments they endured. These were people whose faith unfolded under pressure, surrounded by danger, instability, and the constant awareness that safety was never guaranteed. They did not choose risk once. They lived inside it. Day after day, their existence required vigilance, adaptability, and the willingness to keep going while being pushed from one place to another. For them, faith did not mean settling into something secure. It meant learning how to live lightly, knowing that permanence was fragile. Homes were temporary. Relationships were interrupted. Plans were provisional. Faith became the ability to remain oriented even when everything familiar kept dissolving. Not attachment to place, but loyalty to direction. The chapter speaks of escape, of hiding, of moving through unfamiliar terrain. These are not images of triumph. They are images of survival. Faith here does not announce itself loudly. It whispers through endurance, through the refusal to surrender meaning even when life is reduced to avoidance, waiting, and careful movement through uncertainty. There is a particular strain that comes from living this way, when faith is not practiced in peace, but in motion, when every step forward risks exposure, when trust must coexist with fear rather than replace it. The text does not suggest that fear disappears. It suggests that faith learns how to move with it, without letting it dictate every decision. In these lives, faith is not expressed through construction or sacrifice, but through persistence under threat. Through the quiet courage of continuing to exist meaningfully when the world offers no stable ground. And by placing these stories alongside the others, the chapter widens its definition once again. Faith is not only found in decisive moments or patient waiting, but also in the daily resolve to survive without losing oneself. There is a turn in the chapter that many people read quickly, almost instinctively. After so many stories of movement, endurance, and costly obedience, the text slows down and refuses to offer resolution. It speaks of lives marked not by escape, but by remaining, not by rescue, but by exposure. These are people whose faith did not lead them out of suffering, but carried them through it without relief. What is striking is the absence of explanation. There is no attempt to justify why deliverance did not come. No effort to frame loss as a hidden victory. The chapter does not soften the reality, it simply names it. Some were not spared. Some endured pain without being rescued, and still, their faith is honored alongside all the others. This challenges the assumption that faith must always result in visible protection. Here, faith exists without outcome, without reversal, without the comfort of a final turn. It is not rewarded in time. It is not compensated with clarity. It remains unresolved, and yet, the text insists that these lives belong in the same story. There is something profoundly unsettling about this honesty. It refuses to use suffering as a lesson or a warning. It does not explain it away. Instead, it suggests that faith is not validated by survival, but by fidelity. By the decision to remain human, to remain oriented, even when life narrows into pain, with no promise of relief. In this part of the chapter, faith does not conquer, it endures. It does not overcome the world. It refuses to let the world define the limits of meaning. And by including these stories without commentary, the text makes a quiet claim. Faith does not guarantee protection from loss, but it can preserve dignity within it. As these lives accumulate, something subtle but unmistakable begins to emerge. The chapter is no longer describing isolated examples of belief. It is tracing a pattern. Different people, different circumstances, different outcomes, and yet, the same underlying posture. None of them lived with full visibility. None of them moved through life with complete assurance. And still, they oriented themselves towards something beyond what could be immediately grasped. What unites these lives is not success, protection, or reward. It is direction. Each person makes sense if meaning exists beyond the visible moment. Some moved. Some waited. Some acted. Some endured. Some were spared. Some were not. Faith, in this larger view, does not erase difference. It holds it together. This is where the chapter quietly resists simplification. It refuses to reduce faith to a single expression. Instead, it allows contradiction to remain. Faith can look like leaving everything behind or staying put for years. It can look like building for a future unseen or accepting loss without rescue. What matters is not the shape it takes, but the orientation it preserves. In gathering these stories without forcing them into a neat conclusion, the text suggests that faith is not validated by outcomes, but by coherence, by the way a life remains aligned with meaning even when circumstances pull it apart. Faith becomes the thread that holds disparate experiences together without flattening them into the same result. At this point, the chapter is no longer speaking only about the past. It is creating space for recognition, for the reader to see fragments of their own life reflected back, to realize that faith has always been less about belonging to a tradition and more about participating in a way of living that refuses to let uncertainty be the final authority. At this point, the chapter quietly turns toward the reader. After so many lives lived under tension, it becomes difficult not to recognize something familiar, not the details, but the feeling, the sense of walking without full clarity, of waiting longer than expected, of carrying meaning without knowing whether it will ever be affirmed. These stories do not stay in the past, they begin to overlap with the present. This is where faith stops being a concept and becomes a mirror, not asking whether you believe the right things, but whether you have continued to live with intention when certainty was absent, whether you have kept choosing direction when results did not arrive, whether you have remained present to your own life, even when it felt unresolved and unfinished. Many people assume that their struggle disqualifies them from faith, that doubt, fatigue, or disappointment means they have failed at something essential. But this chapter suggests the opposite. It implies that these experiences are not interruptions to faith, but the very places where it is formed. Faith, here, does not belong to the untroubled. It belongs to those who keep going while being troubled. Seen this way, faith becomes less about believing more, and more about abandoning less. Less about forcing certainty, and more about refusing to let confusion strip life of meaning. It becomes the quiet decision to stay engaged, to remain human, to continue choosing coherence in a world that rarely offers resolution. If this chapter feels heavy, it is because it is honest. It does not promise relief on demand. It does not offer shortcuts. Instead, it offers recognition, a way of understanding that the life you are living, with all its unanswered questions, may already be participating in the same kind of faith this chapter describes. By now, it becomes clear that faith, as this chapter presents it, cannot be reduced to confidence, optimism, or positive expectation. It is not the absence of doubt nor the presence of certainty. It is not a mindset that guarantees protection, success, or clarity. If anything, the lives we have seen suggest the opposite. Faith often exists alongside fear. It grows in uncertainty. It survives disappointment. This matters because many people abandon faith, not because they stopped believing, but because they were taught to expect something it never promised to be. They expected faith to make life lighter, safer, more predictable, and when it didn't, they assumed it had failed. But this chapter quietly dismantles that assumption. It shows that faith was never meant to remove the weight of living. It was meant to give direction within it. Faith here is not a tool for control. It does not manage outcomes or secure futures. It does not explain suffering or guarantee meaning on demand. Instead, it asks something far more subtle and far more demanding. It asks whether a person will continue to orient their life toward meaning, even when meaning cannot be proven, defended, or fully understood. Seen this way, faith becomes less about answers and more about posture, less about what one expects from life, and more about how one chooses to live within it. It is the refusal to let randomness have the final word, the decision to keep acting as if coherence matters, even when chaos feels closer to the truth. This redefinition is not comforting in the usual sense. It does not promise relief, but it offers something quieter and more durable. It offers permission to stop pretending, to stop forcing certainty, to acknowledge that faith, at its core, may be less about believing something specific and more about refusing to abandon meaning altogether. If faith is to be defined at all, this chapter suggests it must be defined gently, not as a claim about the future, but as a stance toward the present. Faith here is the choice to live as if meaning is real, even when it cannot be confirmed, to act as if coherence matters, even when the world feels fragmented and unresolved. This kind of faith does not eliminate uncertainty. It accepts it as part of the human condition. It does not wait for clarity before moving. It learns how to move while clarity is absent. Faith becomes the space where a person decides who they will be, not based on guarantees, but based on values they refuse to abandon. In this sense, faith is not something added to life. It is something revealed by how life is lived, by the decisions made when outcomes are unknown, by the way loss is carried without surrendering dignity, by the quiet insistence that existence is more than accident, even when nothing proves it. The chapter does not argue this point, it embodies it, through lives that remained oriented toward meaning across radically different circumstances, through people who trusted not in explanations but in direction, not in certainty but in the worth of continuing. Faith, then, is not belief in a specific result. It is fidelity to a way of being human, a way that refuses to reduce life to survival, fear, or randomness. It is the decision to remain open, attentive, and responsible, even when answers remain out of reach. And perhaps this is why the chapter ends the way it does. Not with resolution, but with recognition. Faith is not the absence of doubt. It is the presence of commitment in spite of it. A commitment that does not demand proof before it chooses to remain faithful to meaning itself. By this point, it becomes difficult to keep these stories at a distance. Not because they demand belief, but because they describe a way of living that many people recognize in themselves. The long stretches without clarity, the decisions made without guarantees, the quiet resolve to continue even when nothing confirms that continuing is worthwhile. The chapter does not ask the reader to become someone else. It does not present an ideal life to imitate. Instead, it reveals that faith has always taken shape inside ordinary human struggle, inside fatigue, inside doubt, inside the refusal to let uncertainty erase meaning. And in that sense, the line between the ancient stories and the present moment begins to dissolve. If you have ever continued without knowing why, waited longer than you thought you could, or acted in alignment with something you could not fully explain, then you have already encountered the kind of faith this chapter describes, not as achievement, but as participation, not as certainty, but as presence. What makes this realization quiet but powerful is that it removes pressure. Faith is no longer something to reach for in the future. It is something that may already be present, expressed in the way you have endured, adapted, and remained engaged with life, despite its unresolved nature. The chapter does not conclude by elevating its figures above everyone else. It places them alongside us, as witnesses, not judges, as reminders that faith has never belonged exclusively to the confident or the victorious, but to those who continue to live with intention when clarity remains out of reach. And so the chapter ends without tying everything together. There is no final explanation, no summary that resolves the tension it has spent so long building. Instead, it leaves the reader with a sense of incompleteness, not as a flaw, but as an invitation. A reminder that faith, as it has been described, was never meant to conclude neatly within a single lifetime. The lives we have encountered remain unfinished. Their stories do not close with certainty or fulfillment, but with continuity. with the quiet suggestion that what they began was carried forward by others. That faith was never contained in one moment, one decision, or one generation. It moved on, incomplete, unresolved, still open. This refusal to finish the story is deliberate. It acknowledges that faith does not exist to bring closure, but to sustain direction. That meaning is not something one arrives at, but something one participates in over time. The chapter does not offer an ending because it assumes the story is still being lived. In this way, the silence at the end speaks louder than any conclusion could. It leaves space for the present moment, for lives still unfolding, for people still walking without full clarity, still choosing alignment over certainty, still carrying questions that have not been answered. Faith, here, is not something that belonged to the past. It is something that continues. And perhaps that is the most honest thing the chapter can do. Not to explain faith, but to leave it unfinished. To allow it to remain a living posture rather than a closed definition. A story that does not end because it was never meant to. If this chapter spoke to you in a quiet way, you don't need to explain it to anyone. Some stories are meant to be received privately, without commentary or conclusion. Still, every response matters, even the ones that remain unseen. You can support this channel by liking the video and subscribing, not as a gesture of agreement, but as a way of allowing these long, reflective stories to continue reaching people who may be carrying more than they can easily express. If you feel inclined, you may leave a simple symbol in the comments, a single dot, a small stone, a line, not for others to interpret, but as a personal act of recognition, a way of marking that something here resonated, even if it remains unfinished. And if someone comes to mind while listening, someone who has been walking quietly, waiting without clarity, or continuing without reassurance, consider sharing this message with them, not as an answer, but as companionship. The story is not finished. Faith, as this chapter reveals, was never about arriving. Hope is still available, and meaning can still be found, even here,